start a recording, but I'm going to turn that off when we get to the end toward discussion and questions. So I kind of wanted to start us off by just giving a brief description of KHJN's mission. KHJN is a reproductive justice organization. We support Kentuckians toward achieving autonomy in our lives and justice for our communities. We advocate, educate, and provide direct services to ensure all Kentuckians have the power, access, and resources to be healthy and have agency over our lives.
Yeah, so now just introducing each other and myself. My name's Savannah. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Abortion Support Fund Director here at KHJN. My program focuses on supporting folks seeking abortion access. We do this through abortion navigation, funding for their appointments, logistical support, and a lot more.
Hey, I'm Oliver. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the Trans Health Director for Kentucky Health Justice Network. Our Trans Health program helps trans Kentuckians access the healthcare that they need. We do this through direct services like advocacy and connecting people to resources, as well as direct funding for people accessing gender-affirming care, gender-affirming items. We also do a lot of education. We make kind of resource guides and also host monthly educational events, which is, you're at one of our monthly educational events, so welcome.
And while we're situating ourselves in this space, we do want to acknowledge that we are two white people talking about a framework that was developed by Black and Brown women. So why are we doing this? First and foremost, we are here to amplify the leadership and experience of reproductive justice organizers. And because we believe in the power of the RJ movement and the vision of those Black and Brown leaders.
And so expanding on that, what's our intention here? Not to present ourselves as RJ experts, but we do want to try to educate folks about the reproductive justice framework and to give people a means to engage with this work and provide context for why the reproductive justice framework is the way to achieve the stated goals as opposed to single issue organizing or reproductive rights frameworks. So just a quick overview, we just did the introduction. Next, we're going to move into kind of a brief definition of reproductive justice. Then we're going to watch a short video by one of the movement founders, Loretta Ross. Then we're going to do a breakdown of the framework, talk about each of the tenets, do a quick history, and then at the end, we'll have a call to action. And hopefully, if we got our timing correctly at the end, we will have a good time for discussion and questions.
So what is reproductive justice? Sister Song defines reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. So tonight we'll be talking in length about how Black women, Indigenous women, women of color, and trans people have always fought for reproductive justice, even if there wasn't a specific term to define their work. The term reproductive justice was invented in 1994. And for some historical context about the development of this definition, I'm quoting straight from Sister Song's website here. And it says, right before attending the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, where the entire world agreed that the individual right to plan your own family must be central to global development, a group of Black women gathered in Chicago in June of 1994. They recognized that the women's rights movement, led by and representing middle-class and wealthy white women, could not defend the rights and needs of women of color and other marginalized women and trans people. We needed to lead our own national movement to uplift the needs of the most marginalized women, family, and communities. So this is the framework that informs the work that we do at KHJN and has held us accountable to how we show up in this movement space.
So as we mentioned before, we're going to watch a short video from Loretta Ross talking about the reproductive justice movement. Loretta Ross is one of the founders of the visionary movement org Sister Song and the co-creator of the reproductive justice framework. And we just think it's really important to hear what reproductive justice is in her own words.
when it comes to reproductive justice, if you start with the pregnancy, you're starting at the wrong place. You have to start with what's going on in the person's life before they're pregnant. My name is Loretta Ross, and I'm a reproductive justice and human rights activist. I was one of 12 Black women who helped create the term reproductive justice when we spliced together reproductive rights and social justice, because there were social justice issues prevalent in a pregnant person's life long before they even knew they were pregnant. Because if they had housing insecurity or fear of losing their jobs or fear of violence in their lives, that would determine whether they would keep an unplanned pregnancy or not. Now, in short, reproductive justice has three basic principles. Every human being has the right to not have a child and use birth control or abortion or abstinence if that works for them. And we have to fight for the right to have the children that we want to have. And that's the second tenet. And it spawned a whole movement called birth justice, which is to control the conditions under which we have children. And then the third tenet is once the baby is born, we fight for the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments. Now, 10 years after 1994, the LGBT movement added a fourth principle about bodily autonomy, gender identity, and sexual pleasure. I'm not surprised that reproductive justice emerged out of Black women's reproductive experiences, because when we were kidnapped from Africa and brought here to breed as a wealth building strategy for capitalism, then our children were prized. But that same womb product became problematized and criminalized after slavery. I'm really invested in people seeing their entire world through the human rights framework. It doesn't matter what economic or social system you live under, because if it protects your human rights, that's the system you need to work to build. If it violates your human rights, that's the system you work to deconstruct.
Great. So just to reiterate, what she identified as the framework there: the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent the children we have in safe and healthy communities. And then that fourth tenet that came from organizing from queer and trans communities, bodily autonomy and sexual pleasure.
So we'll be analyzing all four tenets, starting with the first tenet of reproductive justice, the right to have children. So some of the threats to this right include things like forced sterilization. So when a governing body forces an individual to undergo a procedure that will prevent them from being able to reproduce. And we know that marginalized communities are often the target of forced sterilization, which we'll talk about more in depth later. Lack of birth justice. This is a much larger conversation that could really be its own webinar, but for the sake of time, we'll condense it to one of the biggest players here being the medical industrial complex. We know that medical racism specifically impacts Black birthing people and can lead to poor maternal health outcomes, including death. And in Kentucky, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. This disparity doesn't have any justification other than structural racism, which reasonably can impact one's desire to have children. Compounding that, our country does not prioritize reproductive healthcare access as a whole. For example, in Kentucky, 76 out of 120 counties don't have access to an OBGYN. And this lack of investment goes even further into something as simple as accurate information being disseminated about supporting pregnancies. Lack of access to modern reproductive technologies and fertility treatment can also be a huge barrier to parents, especially for those without the money, time, and proximity to fertility treatments centers. Fertility treatment is incredibly specialized and ridiculously expensive. And in our culture, it's been seen more as like a luxury and attainable service for all people. Lack of just workplaces, things as basic as employer-paid healthcare and mandatory parental leave are not guaranteed for any individual in the US. Workplace discrimination against pregnant people and people with children is often found in several industries. And being pregnant can threaten someone's hireability or consideration for a promotion. And then stating the obvious, we don't have guaranteed health care in this country, which can significantly impact one's pregnancy experience. Here we're talking about the ability to pay for doula and midwifery services, regular pregnancy checkups, pregnancy complications, which can be incredibly costly, and even hospital childbirth costs. And of course, to dovetail with that is economic inequality, which obviously has historical racial implications as well. Next, we'll dive into the second tenet, which is the right to not have children. So some of the threats to the right to not have children include restricted access to birth control. So for example, in Kentucky, there are many policies in place that make it hard to even get birth control prescriptions on a regular basis. Without that continuity of care, that can increase pregnancy risks. This especially impacts people in rural areas that lack access to reproductive health services. And we also know that state governments are trying to tighten regulations around emergency contraceptives like Plan B. Restrictions on abortion access, huge hot topic. There are now 12 states that have banned abortion at conception, Kentucky being one of them. But even before the reversal of Roe, policies like the Hyde Amendments, insurance coverage barriers, licensing requirements, and other legal hoops have made access virtually impossible for folks to begin with. And we'll talk a lot more about this later. Lack of access to consensual sterilization. We know that there is definitely inequality around who has an easier time going forward with a voluntary sterilization. And that's without confronting the problems with healthcare providers making approvals based on their own morals and opinions. Pervasive sexual violence and reproductive coercion. Here we're talking about abusive situations of forced pregnancy and intimate partner relationships. And lastly, again, lack of universal health care for birth control, abortion, and sterilization. Just for example, an abortion can range from $500 to thousands upon thousands of dollars. I know anecdotally, my voluntary sterilization cost $20,000 before health insurance was included. And all of these healthcare options are obviously very pricey.
So next we were going to talk about the third tenet we mentioned, the right to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. So I wanted to talk about some of the things that are threatening that right. One being a lack of environmental justice. We know communities of color and low-income communities are subject to a disproportionate amount of environmental pollution, which we also know has a negative impact on everyone in those areas, but especially to children. Then CPS. I think most of us on this call know how CPS functions. CPS takes children away mainly from Black and Brown families and communities disproportionately. And then the prison industrial complex works in a similar way, working in tandem with CPS, separating mainly Black and Brown parents from their families and communities. And then if along the same thread, the restrictions on freedom of movement also function to separate parents from their children, mainly Black and Brown parents again. And full stop, obviously also the US immigration system is violent on its face. A lack of housing justice also is going to affect someone's ability to parent the children that they have, and to, especially for low-income families, to keep themselves and their children safe, which can also bring us back to CPS again. Kind of everything below CPS is bringing us back to CPS involvement and threatening a parent's ability to even be in their child's life. There's also a lack of mass support for land back, which we will talk much more about later, but the US was founded with roots of reproductive oppression. And the only way that we can really begin to reckon with that and to give Indigenous families the safety that they deserve is by literally giving the land back. Systemic poverty also obviously impacts your ability to parent a child. There is more than enough in the world for all of us to have everything that we need. But the system that we live under, capitalism, creates scarcity, which creates systemic poverty and all of the negative outcomes that come with that. Workplace injustice also has a huge impact here. There is, for most places, there is not employer-provided healthcare. A lot of people do not get paid maternity leave. And most people in 2023 are not paid a wage that can support a family. Violence and mass shootings also are a barrier to being able to parent your child in a safe and sustainable community, because we can't depend on public safe spaces to be safe. That requires more kind of nuanced decision-making from parents about where they're sending their child and how they're preparing their child to even go to school. Restrictions on second parent adoption and non-traditional family structures, again, take away the autonomy to raise our child within the structures we believe are best, and deprioritize a lot of that community care that is prioritized in marginalized communities. Trans kids also lacking access to medical care, obviously a barrier. It is incredibly hard to give our children all that we need if we are risking facing criminal charges to do so, or we don't even have access to a provider who can provide the care that our child needs. Again, lack of universal health care, common thread throughout all of this. If we can't see doctors when we are sick as parents, or we can't get our children care when they need, obviously that is a threat not only to our ability to parent, but also our ability to just be safe and be healthy, which again feeds into systemic poverty. Can I have the next slide, Savannah? So, bodily autonomy and sexual pleasure. I hope everyone likes the images I picked for this, because I thought they were fun and I made the colors match, and that took time. But anyway, threats to bodily autonomy and sexual pleasure. First, I put the right to fuck there as a question. Do we have that? Do we have the right to fuck in America? That's kind of what I want to evaluate in the rest of these threats. So we don't have access to, or at least most of us do not have access to pleasure-based sex ed. So how can we have a right to fuck if we don't have the information necessary to make informed decisions about our desires and sexual practices? And with that, violence, especially sexual violence, but all forms of violence are going to be attacks on our bodily autonomy, attacks on gender affirming care, and past that, even past that legal distinction, there's a lack of access. People still have to travel long distances for care and often still can't afford it. I also wanted to make a note here about anti-BDSM legislation, because I don't think that's something a lot of people think of when they're thinking about reproductive justice, and even when they're thinking about bodily autonomy. But in most states, consent does not negate an assault charge. So according to the state, you cannot legally consent to any kind of bodily injury, including consensual BDSM. And then again, circling back to the right to parent our children, there are no privacy regulations to shield BDSM practitioners from having their sexual preferences exposed in court cases like divorce or child custody disputes, which can then result in them losing the ability to parent their child. Obviously, the criminalization of sex work is also a big attack on bodily autonomy here. And in addition to being a threat to bodily autonomy, puts sex workers in a more vulnerable position because they're having to, avoid criminalization. And then all of these, I put structural gender-based violence. We could talk all day about every instance of structural gender-based violence that exists in the US, but pretty much everything we have mentioned so far in these past 3 slides have been examples of structural gender-based violence. And I also wanted to give note to kind of our societal deprioritization of pleasure as a barrier here. So I think slowly this is changing over time, but societally still pleasure is deprioritized in daily life in favor of things that feed capitalism, like productivity and reproduction. And then again, common thread, lack of universal healthcare. Here I wanted to name specifically, I'm talking about people not having access to STI testing and treatment, people not having access to pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV prevention, people not having access to HIV care, people not having access to gender affirming care as well.
So now we're going to touch on some historical instances of reproductive oppression. For the sake of time, this is US specific, although we know that reproductive oppression impacts people globally. And additionally, this is not an exhaustive list, but rather just some introductory information. We also want to provide a trigger warning. There will be mentions of racial violence, reproductive oppression and coercion, implications of sexual assault, genocide, and family separation. If you need time to step away from your computer to keep yourself safe from these triggering topics, please do so. We'll be back to talking about RJ as a human rights framework in about 10 minutes. So we cannot talk about the history of reproductive oppression without talking about colonization. The very inception of this country was founded by enforcing control, theft, and dehumanization to prop up white supremacy, capitalism, and cis heteropatriarchy. I'm so sorry for my dog in the background. A reproductive justice organizer, Mala Munoz, writes in an article for Everyday Feminism, stating colonization was the process of taking power and control of land and labor from indigenous and enslaved African people. Colonizers used rape as a way to take power and control of indigenous people's bodies away from them and dominate native societies. So we know that colonizers used sexual violence as a means of controlling indigenous people. And taking a step further, colonizers participated in mass genocide to wipe out entire indigenous cultures and genealogy. This process was rooted in eugenics, with the goal for the white race and Western European traditions to dominate the Americas. The entire process of colonization of the Americas threatens all tenets of reproductive justice.
So next we wanted to talk about forced birth and forced sterilization. When I'm talking about forced birth here, I'm mainly talking about forced birth enacted upon enslaved people. Enslaved people were forced to give birth and were sexually assaulted incredibly regularly. And forced birth was critical to the continuation of slavery. Loretta Ross talked about that a little bit in the video. But enslaved people knew that their enslavers depended upon their ability to give birth to increase the enslaved population. So this could be a point of resistance among enslaved people via avoiding sexual contact and by having abortions. And in this, they utilized intergenerational knowledge of plants and medicines as a means of preventing pregnancy and inducing abortion. For forced sterilization, I think it's important to note that in our research for this presentation, we were inundated with instances of forced sterilization in the US, way too much to cover in the amount of time we have. And that a lot of it is not recorded. There are a lot of historic injustices, particularly in the US, that we just will never know about because we don't have the records. But in 1907, Indiana became the first state to enact forced sterilization, targeting people with developmental disabilities. This was obviously not the beginning of forced sterilization or eugenics in the US, but it did mark the beginning of a wave of legally forced sterilization. In 1981, that is known as the year of the last legal forced sterilization, which took place in Oregon. However, we know that this practice continued at least until 2010 in the US prison system and was continuing into 2020 in ICE detention centers.
So family separation is another tool of reproductive oppression to harm families. Dorothy Roberts coins the CPS system as the family policing system. And she also explains that the origins of child protective services began with slavery. And after the abolition of slavery, there were still many instances over time where Black and brown children were separated from their families for the sake of providing labor. CPS has modernized to attack parents and claim negligence instead of addressing root issues like poverty. But we know that these children that are often taken from their homes are just reoriented into violent environments within the foster care system until they eventually age out. Deportation is also another tool to separate families due to arbitrary documentation requirements and arbitrary borders. 25% of people who have been deported by the US government are parents of US citizens. And between the years of 2009 to 2015, which is just 6 years, about 500,000 parents were separated from their children. And it's important to note here that in our research, we couldn't find data that included children that weren't US citizens, or the number of children that have been detained over time in inhumane detention facilities that were also taken away from their parents. And then another instance of family separation we can examine is boarding schools that forced assimilation to Indigenous children. The goal here was clearly to destroy their cultural identity and prop up white supremacy and Eurocentric ideals. And we know that the history of these boarding schools are especially horrific, with things like sexual abuse running rampant and also some abuses leading to death. Next, we'll talk about how the medical industrial complex has impacted DIY healthcare. So here we're speaking to the regulation, delegitimization, and criminalization of healthcare outside of the medical industrial complex. Because we know historically communities, particularly marginalized communities like communities of color, trans and queer communities, have turned away from the medical industrial complex to access necessary care. And this deviation is often not only criticized, but criminalized, and returning power back to the medical industrial complex that continues to perpetuate harm. For example, before modern gynecology, births were traditionally supported by midwives and doulas, often Black women. And it was white men who created the practice of gynecology and destroyed the cultural significance of community-provided care for reproductive health. We can also see this with self-managed abortion, something that was incredibly common and individualized up until the most recent century. And now, while most states don't specifically have a law about self-managed abortion, they'll manipulate the law to specifically target marginalized people's pregnancy outcomes that may include self-managed abortion.
So we've been talking a lot. I wanted to give you all a chance to drop in the chat. What common thread have you noticed among those historical instances of reproductive oppression? Yes, rampant racism, absolutely. Power, control, racism, totally. So much of it ties right back into white supremacy, state punishing people, absolutely. Reinforcing those power structures. That's a lot of the function of reproductive oppression. Yes, colonization, control, ass backwards logic, absolutely. Zero autonomy, criminalization, state violence, and systemic oppression, all incredibly correct. Y'all are on the nose. My thought here is along the same lines as what everyone else was thinking. So super cool, we're all on the same page here. But the common thread for me is targeting the most marginalized people, namely Black and brown people, for reproductive control and coercion. So reproductive justice is a tool of white supremacy, capitalism, cis heteropatriarchy, and other systems of oppression. And since reproductive injustice is necessary to maintain those systems, reproductive justice in itself threatens the maintenance of those very systems.
So reproductive justice is a human rights framework that is explicitly opposed to all systems of oppression. And this is uniquely different from the mainstream activism around reproductive rights. The best way that we can draw this delineation between justice as rights is who is being centered in this advocacy. So as stated by Sister Song, the women's rights movements led by and representing middle-class and wealthy white women could not defend the needs of women of color and other marginalized women and trans people. So we can conclude that reproductive rights focus on the legality of reproductive health rather than the access to it, which has largely only benefited cis white women. We've seen historically how white feminism has deviated from reproductive justice, and this continues to be present in our movement spaces today. We can see this in the sensationalizing of Roe versus Wade, in believing that Roe is infallible and enough. And that's been especially problematic for Black and Brown people, trans people, poor people, people in rural areas, people with disabilities, and people in the Deep South. We can also see how modern white feminism has aligned with capitalism and hyper-independence by advocating for girl boss CEOs and girl boss billionaires, instead of advocating for collective liberation and community care. The main divergence white feminism has from reproductive justice could be summarized as a lack of an intersectional approach. This can be seen with attempts to resolve specific outcomes that affect white women rather than addressing systems of oppression at large. Loretta Ross explains, neglecting to make the link between race and rights in reproduction, the pro-choice movement has always insufficiently analyzed how political activism by communities of color particularly alarms opponents of civil rights, indigenous rights, women's rights, gay rights, etc. Reproductive justice work at its core is expansive, holistic, and intersectional.
So coming off of some of those historical instances of reproductive oppression, we wanted to give space for some RJ wins, efforts that have been made moving toward reproductive justice. One of the first things I think about when I think about a reproductive justice win is the advent of abortion funds and the widespread nature of abortion funds across the US. Abortion funds prioritize access over rights, prioritize mutual aid over bureaucratic restrictions on support, and help create an infrastructure of community care, especially thinking about those abortion funds, which also provide practical support. Another kind of recent RJ win is an end to forced sterilization in prison. And in 2021, imprisoned people and informally imprisoned people in California who were forcibly sterilized actually won a compensation program. So some at least recognition that the state did wrong. The state actually did wrong, which is unfortunately very rare in the US. Also, 37 states now outlaw the shackling of pregnant people during birth. I think it's important to mention, like, it's weird that this is what we need to celebrate. This is a very marginal win. Obviously, that should be all 50 states. Shackling any person, especially someone who is pregnant, is inhumane on its face. But acknowledging that 37 states have at least moved in the correct direction. There have also been some recent wins from getting Medicaid coverage for doula care, talking about in Oregon, Minnesota. I know we had a Minnesotan on the call, New Jersey, Florida, Maryland, Virginia, and literally as of last week, Michigan. Hell yeah, Michigan. Also, reproductive justice advocates and organizations have been key in influencing Health and Human Services to include more and more protections for gender affirming care.
So how did RJ prepare us for a post-Dobbs reality, the situation that we are in now? I know for myself in my work, I've been asked this a lot. And to put it simply, we've been here. Reproductive justice orgs, specifically abortion funds, had an infrastructure in place to address a post-Dobbs landscape long before Roe was ever going to be overturned. This was based on our intersectional understanding of abortion access. Abortion funds operated within the Roe era and understood the limitations of Roe, especially for marginalized communities. It's important to recognize all the limitations Roe had and what resulted from that. Firstly, the Hyde Amendment. Just 3 years after Roe was established, the Hyde Amendment was passed to ban federal funds from being used on abortion care. So this has impacted people who rely on Medicaid for healthcare coverage. And then from then on, there has been incremental attacks on abortion access that Roe could never defend. The fact of the matter is, especially speaking as a Kentuckian, we have never had adequate access to abortion. Abortion funds have existed for decades to address where policy has often fallen short. And we take care of our communities no matter what through mutual aid, direct giving, and community-centered care, all the things provided by the reproductive justice framework.
So we wanted to end our part of the presentation with a call to action, just some ways that you can get involved. I think number one, you've taken the first step in investing in your understanding your positionality and your role in furthering reproductive justice. So continuing to interrogate that and figure out how you can use the RJ lens to address what is within your sphere of influence. And then the other one, super obvious, but become connected to and invested in people and organizations doing reproductive justice work in your area. With that, I want to name, I know we have a lot of people outside of Kentucky. Obviously, if you're in Kentucky, we have KHJN. In Louisville, there is an organization called Black Birth Justice as well. There are also lots of other organizations doing RJ work in Kentucky. But wherever you are, if you're unable to find people doing reproductive justice organizing in your area, you can feel free to email